For decades, the world saw Julian Lennon as the quiet son of a legend, polite, distant, and endlessly misunderstood. But behind that calm face was a story soaked in silence, anger, and heartbreak. When he finally spoke, his confession stunned everyone. It wasn't about fame, money, or legacy. It was about pain, the kind that no amount of peace songs could erase. The weight of a name. Julian Charles John Lennon was born on April 8, 1963, in Liverpool, the same city that would soon become the epicenter of a cultural revolution. From the very beginning, he carried a name that wasn't just his own. His father was already on the rise with the Beatles, a band that was turning from a local curiosity into a global phenomenon. But while the world saw joy, music, and freedom, life inside the Lennon household told a very different story. His mother, Cynthia Powell, was gentle and private, the opposite of the man she had fallen in love with. John was brilliant, unpredictable, and already restless. When the band's fame exploded in 1964, the young family's world shifted overnight. Reporters camped outside their home, and letters flooded in from fans who worshipped John. To the public, Cynthia was the Beatles' wife, and Julian, the Beatles' baby. But behind closed doors, fame had begun to corrode the foundation of their home. John was away for months at a time, touring across continents. Cynthia was left to raise their son alone, trying to keep life as normal as possible. There were long nights when the phone never rang, and when it did, it was often to say John wouldn't be home. By the time Julian could speak, his father was more myth than man. A voice on the radio, a face on a magazine cover, a stranger who shared his last name. Cynthia tried to give her son a quiet, grounded life. She took him for walks in the countryside, told him bedtime stories, and kept him away from the madness surrounding the Beatles. But she couldn't shield him from the truth forever. When John met Yoko Ono at an art exhibition in 1966, the fragile peace that held their family together began to crumble. The phone calls stopped completely. Rumors spread that John had found a new muse, someone who would soon replace both wife and child in his life. By 1968, John had moved on entirely, leaving Cynthia and 5-year-old Julian behind. Divorce papers followed, along with a lifetime of emotional distance. For Julian, it was the day his childhood ended. He wasn't just losing a father, he was losing the idea of family itself. There was no dramatic goodbye, no explanation, just absence. Cynthia tried to hold the pieces together. She sold her wedding ring, old furniture, even family heirlooms, to pay for school fees and rent. She worked tirelessly to make sure Julian had stability, even when she had none. The world assumed that being a Lennon meant luxury, but their life was one of struggle, second-hand clothes, and quiet resilience. Julian grew up watching his mother's exhaustion and his father's image plastered everywhere, on records, posters, and television. The man who abandoned him was adored by millions. It was a cruel contradiction that shaped how Julian would see the world forever. He once said that people assumed being John Lennon's son was a privilege. They didn't see what it took away from me, he reflected years later. Every time he heard one of his father's songs, he felt two things at once: admiration and pain. Love, help, and All You Need Is Love weren't just music. They were reminders of everything he never received. By the time he reached adolescence, he had learned an uncomfortable truth. The world could love a man completely, while his own child could feel invisible. This was the paradox that would define Julian Lennon's life. To millions, he was part of a legend, but in his own heart, he was a boy left standing in the shadow of it, a father's absence. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Julian Lennon's childhood unfolded in the long shadow of a father who had become a symbol for the world and a ghost to his own son. John Lennon was now inseparable from Yoko Ono, the woman he called his muse, his partner, and the person who inspired his artistic rebirth. Together, they became the faces of a new kind of celebrity, outspoken, radical, unfiltered. But for Julian and his mother, it was like watching a movie they were no longer part of. Cynthia raised Julian as best she could, keeping life modest and steady while his father traveled the world. They lived in small flats, far removed from the glamour that surrounded the Beatles. Cynthia tried to fill both parental roles, nurturing him, protecting him, and teaching him humility despite his famous last name. She refused to speak badly about John, even when her heart was broken. "He's still your father," she would remind her son. But the unspoken truth lingered. John had built a new life, and they weren't in it. Julian often caught glimpses of that other life through magazines and television. Pictures of John and Yoko appeared everywhere, lying in bed during peace protests, giving interviews about love and harmony. It was surreal for Julian to see the man who had walked away preaching compassion to the entire world. He would later admit that those images filled him with confusion more than hatred. How could a man who sang about peace abandon the people who needed his love the most? As Julian grew older, the separation began to feel like rejection. There were no regular visits, no birthday calls, no guidance through school or life. Every once in a while, a small gift would arrive in the mail, a record, a postcard, a token gesture. But even those came less and less. Teachers and classmates treated him differently. Some envied him, assuming fame meant fortune. Others bullied him, calling him the forgotten Beatles kid. By the early 1970s, Julian had developed a quiet resentment toward both his father and the world that adored him. He rarely spoke about John publicly, but his silence said everything. Inside, he was fighting two battles, one against the emptiness his father left behind, and another against becoming defined by that absence. Then, unexpectedly, a door reopened. Around 1974, John separated from Yoko and began a relationship with his assistant May Pang. During that period, known later as his Lost Weekend, John reached out to Julian. It was the first real contact they'd had in years. May encouraged John to reconnect, and for a brief, precious time, father and son began building something that resembled a bond. Julian visited his father in Los Angeles. They talked, laughed, listened to records, and for the first time, John seemed genuinely present. He even gave Julian his first guitar and a small drum machine, teaching him how to play simple rhythms. Those memories, fragile and fleeting, would become some of Julian's most treasured moments. They represented a glimpse of the father he always hoped for. But as soon as it had begun, it ended. When John reunited with Yoko in 1975, the connection faded again. The phone stopped ringing, and the letters went unanswered. John's focus shifted to his newborn son, Sean, who arrived that October. He announced to the press that he was retiring from music to dedicate himself to fatherhood. To the world, it was touching. To Julian, it was unbearable. He once admitted that seeing pictures of his father cradling Sean made him feel as though I didn't exist. For years, Julian carried the silent ache of that contradiction, watching his father become the loving parent to another child that he had never been to him. The distance grew not only in miles, but in meaning. John was no longer just gone. He was unreachable, untouchable, almost mythical. The boy who once looked up to him with longing now looked at him with quiet disbelief. Yet, in his heart, a small hope remained, the kind of hope that only children of broken families understand. Hope that one day his father might look back, remember the boy he left behind, and come home. The night the music died. On December 8, 1980, everything stopped. John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota Building in New York by a disturbed fan named Mark David Chapman. The news tore through the world in minutes. Crowds gathered outside his apartment, sobbing, lighting candles, singing Imagine. But in a quiet house in North Wales, a 17-year-old boy woke up to a world that had fallen apart. Julian was staying with his mother when they heard the news. The chimney in his attic room had collapsed that night, bricks and dust falling into the darkness. Later, he would say it felt symbolic, as if his entire world had caved in. His last memory of his father was that phone call, that song filled with hope. Now that hope was gone forever. There was no funeral. Yoko Ono announced there would be no public ceremony, only silence. Julian received no invitation, no closure. The world mourned a legend, but he mourned the stranger who had once been his father. His grief was different, not for the man the world adored, but for the relationship that never had the chance to heal. The shock deepened when John's will was revealed. Nearly everything went to Yoko and Sean. Julian was left with a small trust fund, £100,000, a fraction of the estate worth over $200 million. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition. To be left out felt like being erased from his father's story. The headlines painted him as bitter, but the truth was far simpler. He wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, to know he mattered, fighting for a name. The years that followed turned Julian into a reluctant fighter. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he battled for what he believed was his rightful inheritance. Not for wealth, but for identity. For nearly 2 decades, lawyers went back and forth. Every negotiation with Yoko Ono was cold and exhausting. She held the power. Control over John's image, his catalog, his possessions. For Julian, each legal letter was another reminder of how little space he had in his father's legacy. People often misunderstood his motives, calling him greedy. But Julian's fight was never about fortune. It was about belonging. He wanted his father's instruments, letters, drawings, the personal things that carried emotional weight. Eventually, in the mid-1990s, an agreement was reached. The sum was rumored to be around $20 million. It gave him financial stability, but not peace. "Money can't buy the memories you never had," he once said. The settlement ended the legal war, but not the emotional one. His resentment toward Yoko remained strong. She represented everything that had broken his childhood. The woman who replaced his mother, who took his father away, who now held his legacy. When Julian finally confessed, "I utterly hated her," it wasn't spoken out of rage. It was the raw truth of decades spent living in someone else's shadow. It was a wound that words could no longer hide. Brothers in the shadow of Lennon. Despite everything, something unexpected grew out of that pain. A fragile bond with his half-brother, Sean Lennon. For years, Julian had avoided any contact. But as time passed, he realized Sean wasn't the enemy. They were both victims of the same myth, sons of a man too large to live up to. Their upbringings were different, but their pain was shared. Sean grew up loved and sheltered. Julian grew up distant and searching. Yet both carried the same impossible burden: to be John Lennon's sons. In 2006, Julian attended one of Sean's concerts in Paris. Watching his younger brother perform stirred something inside him. He didn't see competition or resentment anymore, only pride. From that moment, their relationship changed. They spent time together on Sean's tours, sharing stories, laughter, and memories of the father they barely knew in the same way. In 2021, at the London premiere of the Beatles' Get Back documentary, the brothers sat side by side, watching old footage of John in the studio, young, alive, joking. For Julian, it was a revelation. For years, he had remembered his father only as the man who left. But in that film, he saw glimpses of kindness, humor, creativity, the man his mother once loved. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. He later said, "For the first time, I understood what people saw in him: letting go." By his 60s, Julian had learned that peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from deciding not to fight anymore. His relationship with Yoko never became warm, but it evolved into a silent truce, built not on affection, but on understanding. He stopped seeing her as an enemy and started seeing her as a human being connected to someone they both loved. The bitterness slowly faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He realized that holding on to anger only hurt one person, himself. Julian found new purpose beyond the Lennon legacy. Music was once his refuge, but constant comparisons to his father made it unbearable. So he turned to photography and storytelling, forms of expression that were entirely his own. His 2020s exhibitions, like Timeless and Life's Fragile Moments, were deeply personal meditations on memory and identity. In them, he explored what it means to see beauty in imperfection, a philosophy that mirrored his own journey. He now speaks openly about living in peace, not the kind his father sang about, but the kind you earn after decades of surviving heartbreak. "I wouldn't say a coming of age," he once said, "but it was taking ownership of that name, and all I've been through." Julian Lennon's story isn't about fame or forgiveness. It's about learning how to live with pain without letting it define you. He never got the father he wanted, but he found the strength to become his own man. Do you think Julian ever truly forgave Yoko Ono? Or did he just learn to let go? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories behind the legends of music.